Well, a couple years ago, the National Trust for Historic Preservation launched a campaign called This Place Matters, and they encouraged people to go out around their communities with little signs that said, "This place matters," and take a picture of it. Well, my presentation tonight is about This Place Mattered, because there are a lot of great buildings in our community that are no longer standing, and there are a number of great buildings that are really underutilized, and so I'm going to talk about that a little bit tonight. Now, if you go back to the early 20th century, really until the middle of the 20th century, the first block of West Market Street must have been an amazing place. It was a hub of retail activity. We had Bears and Bon-Ton and Jack's and Lafayette and McCrory's and Fleur's and a number of other stores. But things happened. These things happened. The York Mall, the York County Shopping Center, the North Mall. They pulled the retailers from downtown York to the suburbs. Those that remained, like Jack's and Bears, eventually went out of business. Now, the first block of West Market Street, this shot is the south side, sort of looking towards Continental Square, has changed over the years. You can see here, two of the buildings still remain, the Hartman building on the far left and the Rump building beside it. But then the two buildings on the right-hand side, one was Lafayette's department store and one was the first McCrory's in York. Well, McCrory's expanded and knocked down two of those buildings. Today, actually, the view hasn't changed much in the past 50 years, but what has changed is that these buildings are largely underutilized. There are vacancies. There are places that mattered a lot to York City that don't really matter as much anymore. Right next door stands a Weiss department store. A lot of us know it as the Wolf Building or the home of the York County Community Foundation. That's what it looked like when it was built. But like a lot of retailers did, we modernized, and modernization meant rip off any great architectural details and try to be a plain skeleton. And then they modernized again, and that's actually how the building looks today. That vertical siding was extremely popular in the 1960s, but at least we still have the building. At least the building is still being heavily utilized. It still matters to our community. And you can't blame the building owners, because look what happened to Bear's department store and Fleur Brothers Jewelry Store. And then we had that wonderful parking garage on the first block of East Market Street that blessedly was renovated a couple years ago. Now, one of the greatest buildings ever built in York City was that of York City Market, designed by J.A. Demple, built in 1879, and one of the most significant structures ever created in York County. Now, it's hard to believe that in less than 90 years, this building would be demolished. And it would be demolished to make way for a gas station. And the thing is, when Gulf Oil, remember the Gulf service stations that used to be everywhere, when they applied to demolish it, there were quite a few signatures. There was a petition. Hundreds of people were against the market being demolished. But when it went to City Council and the hearing was held, only one person showed up to protest. So the city approved demolition. It was demolished for a cost of $17,000. And the cost to renovate it and bring it up to where it needed to be, $20,000. Right next door was the York Collegiate Institute. Anybody here go to school there? One. That was such a part of our community. It was also designed by the Demple firm, and thousands of students were educated there. It too was torn down in the 1960s. So you think of the way that block looked in the early 20th century, you think of the way that block looked in the 1960s, and what happened to it. There were so many stories that people had, so many memories in those buildings. My father-in-law, who's here tonight, lived right across the street from the Collegiate Institute. His father was the minister at what used to be Duke Street United Methodist Church. He remembers when he was a kid, his brothers were older, they'd go across the street with wagons and carts and they'd help people load the groceries for a few cents. And then he went to college right there. And so when he drives by that block now, he remembers where he used to live and where the neighborhood used to be. This is that same view today. Those places mattered a lot. And what is that neighborhood today without them? When those buildings were torn down, that neighborhood lost its heart. 2 years ago, it almost lost its soul. Trinity United Methodist Church is only located a block away from those buildings, and it too was slated for demolition. Historic York and other organizations stepped forth and said, this can't happen. This building is too important to the surrounding community. Unfortunately, it has not yet been demolished. A new congregation has purchased it and they plan to renovate it. It's still not out of the woods yet, but it's getting closer. Demolition has been part of York's history from the very early days. This is the first York County Courthouse, or what we would refer to as the Colonial Courthouse. This is how it looked after it was expanded in the early 1800s. It was demolished in 1841 when a new courthouse was constructed half a block away. What stories could this building have told us? It could have told us about Continental Congress, about the governing of the young country and the Articles of Confederation and conspiracy, and how John Adams and Sam Adams were in York and they hated George Washington. So many stories embodied in that building. I love this sketch from the late 1800s. Most of the captions are written in Pennsylvania Dutch, but there's one caption written in English, and it says, "The Vandals at Work." People recognized this building was too important to demolish, and yet it still was. So what replaced it was market sheds. And these open-air markets were very popular in the York community for really almost 200 years. But in the middle of the night in 1886, the town demolished the markets. It was deemed that they were an impediment to progress because they were blocking the middle of the road. Now, York's not alone in demolition. If you drive through Harrisburg and you know where to look, there's some phenomenal historic buildings. But to the typical passerby, Harrisburg has a lot of mid-20th century high-rise buildings that are pretty nondescript. They weren't built in open spaces, on open lots, on green space. Buildings had to fall for those towers to rise, and these are the buildings that fell. In Lancaster, they had a brilliant idea in the early 1960s. That's to demolish an entire block and make a concrete superstructure and very simple, plain, unadored buildings with very few windows. Well, it failed. Most of that has been demolished, and some of it will probably be demolished. But on the top left there, that is the nation's first Woolworth building. The Woolworth building of New York City is iconic, but before that existed, this was the Woolworth building. Go on to Google News, and all you need to do is search on demolition and preservation, and you're going to come up with hundreds of stories about buildings that are in jeopardy. I did this last week. One article was about the tallest building in the Lehigh Valley, slated for demolition. Another was about Baltimore's Morris Mechanic Theater. It is an icon of brutalism architecture. I'm not a fan of the style, but it's very important structure architecturally, and City Council just said it's okay to demolish. We have a different viewpoint on preservation than we did. In the early 20th century, preservation was viewed as Williamsburg, colonial structures, and that held true right through the 1960s when our city market, when our Collegiate Institute were demolished. Well, as they were coming down in New York City, Penn Station was being demolished. It was an extremely important architectural structure in the Beaux-Arts style, and the New York Times even said there's no way this building would ever be demolished, and then it was demolished. And that got people to change the thinking that maybe structures built in the past 100 years are as important as the colonial structures. But have we learned our lesson? This year, 300,000 buildings will be demolished in the United States. Today, 600 older and historic homes were demolished. Tomorrow, another 600 will fall, and the day after that. That is our rate of demolition for people's homes in the United States. What happens to that waste? Some of it is reused, but most of it goes to landfills. And in landfills today, 25 to 40% of the content come from building demolition. Have we really learned any lessons? The cyclorama was in the news a lot lately. There was a fight to preserve it that lasted for many years. There was legal fees on the side that wanted to demolish it, the National Park Service. There were legal fees on the side that wanted to preserve it, the Recent Past Network, and other preservationists. It dragged on for years, and the courts went one way and then they went the other way. This building was demolished earlier this year. Its neighbor, the old visitor center, which prior to that was a museum, was also demolished. There weren't as many tears shed because the cyclorama was designed by Richard Neutral. He's a famous modernist architect from the middle of the 20th century, and this is one of his most important buildings and his only public building east of the Mississippi River. So there was a long fight to preserve it. Now the cost to demolish it was $3.3 million, and there were several $1 million in legal fees expended. What would have happened if that money would have been into preserving this building? Closer to home, there's a shot of it coming down. As you can see, not much was recycled. Closer to home, we have the old Avalon barn. Now, when we lost this building earlier this year, we lost two pieces of history, because a lot of us remember Avalon Farms, and a lot of us know that building as Falscraft, and Falscraft is another icon that's no longer with us in the local community. So when it was demolished, it broke a lot of hearts. For me, a lot of the damage had previously been done. Does anybody remember Avalon's restaurant, the mini golf course, the driving range? I have memories from there. I remember going to the drive-in with my family and playing mini golf with my sister and going to the driving range with friends, and those memories were embodied in these buildings that were demolished. The Lincoln Highway Garage was another important structure. Architecturally, it has no merit, and truth be told, it was falling apart. But when you look at buildings in York that are recognized nationally, we have the Shoe House and we had the Lincoln Highway Garage, because it was one of the last of the original Lincoln Highway garages. And so every guide you would pick up on the highway, coast to coast, would have a picture of this building in its heyday. So there was somewhat of a preservation battle to save it, but in the end, the owner needed to sell. He was retiring. A ton of money needed to be put into the building because it had deteriorated. And you know what? Turkey Hill did not do a bad job when they built their own convenience store. They paid homage to what had been there. They put in interpretive murals, so you can still learn about what stood there. They actually did a very good job when they replaced that building. We have a good friend in preservation in the York Daily Record. They bring articles, they tell us news, they tell us buildings that are in danger. They're constantly on the case for preservation, and part of the reason by that is editor Jim McClure. He writes the York Town Square blog, and he just wrote a blog about valuing our heritage and the importance of saving our buildings. So we're lucky to have them. We're lucky to have Blake Stout, who's with us tonight. He has his own little organization he created, a Facebook group, and it's called Preserving York. And Blake blogs about these important buildings. He brings history to life, and he actually conducts tours of historic buildings. So we have a lot of friends in the community. Maybe we just don't have enough. Because the reality is, the villain of our story is not a bank. It's not the National Park Service. It's not Turkey Hill. The villain is us. And we're the villain because we have this culture. In America, we have a throwaway mentality. We allow buildings to fall day after day after day in the name of progress. This poster actually was created for the first Earth Day in the 1970s. So let's think about things differently, because historic preservation sometimes have a negative connotation. People hear preservation and they think of the tree huggers that tie themselves to buildings. They think that it's requiring people to use a certain paint color on their shutters, and that's not really what preservation is all about. So let's drop the word historic and let's think about community. Because the reality is that historic preservation is community preservation. And if you don't believe it, go to South Duke Street and stand where the Market and the Collegiate Institute once stood, and let's talk about those buildings. If we had preserved them, that community would have been preserved. It would not have declined like it has in the past 30 or 40 years. Likewise, in historic preservation, we have a term called historic rehabilitation, and that refers to taking a building, renovating it in a historically sensitive manner, but then turning it into a new use. Another term is adaptive reuse. And I really think that historic rehabilitation is community rehabilitation, because when you're able to do this, when you're able to rehabilitate a building for a new use, you are keeping the building and you are revitalizing the building, and you are vitalizing the building, the community around it. Now, several years ago, there was a study completed called The Soul of the Community. And basically, the foundation that conducted it, the Knight Foundation, went to 26 communities of all sizes across the United States, and they asked residents what matters most to them. The findings were fascinating. Most important to the resident of a town are the social offerings. They want to know that there's something to do, that there's a nightlife, that they can go places and hang out with friends and they can meet new people. Social offerings is number one. Number two is openness. Now, this is not openness of space, this is openness of community. Our community is welcoming of retirees, of families with young kids, of students that recently graduated from college, of people of all races, shapes, sizes, creeds, whatever the case may be. That is the number two most important thing to people in these communities. Number three, though, and this has a major impact on the built environment, is the aesthetics. Now, aesthetics ranks above education, leadership, and safety. People think the look of their community is more important than the safety of their community. That was revealed in a study completed in 2008 and again in 2010. So the aesthetics are your open spaces, your parks and trails. It's the physical beauty of a community. It's the architecture. It's what we're talking about today. So we're going to talk about some of the physical beauty that this community used to have, and some of the beauty that it still does. This was known as Small's Mercantile Block. It's actually the first block of East Market Street. If you want to know what stands there today, it's the East Market Street parking garage. Now, it's a great improvement over what it was a few years ago, but I'll be the first to argue that a large parking garage half a block from the town square is highly underutilized space. And then you look at what used to be there, and what stories could those buildings have told us? The Small family was vital in building York. There's so much of York's history that runs through the Small family. We could have learned about early retailing in York. There's actually a business and a shorthand college that was located there. There are so many stories these buildings could tell us. So I look at that picture and it bums me out. But then I drive through by Coda and I look at the old and new and I see how they've taken an old building and they've repurposed it. And I said, you know what? This is community rehabilitation. It's not just historic rehabilitation, because it added something to that block as the stadium across the street did. But then I think about beer. It's always nice to think about beer when you're very close to a brewery. And in the case of York, these were breweries. These were buildings that stood in York. The York City Brewing and Helb's Keystone Brewing. Where Helb's was located was the intersection of King and Queen Streets, and there's a parking lot there today. What could these buildings have told us about the brewing industry in New York, about industry in general? The York County Heritage Trust has the annual Microbrew Fest and Tavern Tour. Imagine those events of these breweries were still standing over York. Fortunately, a drive through the Avenues neighborhood is good for the soul, isn't it? Look at what's been done there just the past few years. These old Victorian homes have been lovingly and painstakingly restored, and you sense the community as you drive through the neighborhood. You know that these are people that take a lot of pride in their homes, in their neighbors, and their community. But there are so many great buildings that have fallen. What you're seeing here on the top left is the Balzer Spangler House. It was located, we believe, on the 400 block of Prospect Street, actually very, very close to where Historic York's offices used to be. Why should you care about that? Well, it was one of the oldest buildings in the town of York. It actually was where the first county elections were held, and it was later a boarding house. And this young troublemaker by the name of John Wilkes Booth spent several weeks in that boarding house. What stories could that building tell us? And the one on the bottom right, that was Ye Old Valley Inn. You know what stands there today? It's the Walmart parking lot. That building was built in the 1750s. It could have told us about the Continental Congress, because members of Congress went both ways, back and forth, and certainly stopped in there along the way. It could have told us about the Underground Railroad, because it's widely believed to have been a station on the Underground Railroad. It could have told us about the Civil War, because 1,800 Georgians in Gordon's brigade marched by there in 1863, going to Wrightsville and coming from Wrightsville in the days leading to the Battle of Gettysburg. But then you go right up the street here and you see the old Bonton building. This was rejuvenated by the York County Commissioners in 1989, and then again just in the past 2 years. The top left shows you what it was in the 1970s and 80s, and it's a wonderful building. It does so much for our community. What goes on inside it has changed. It's not a retailer, but with the government center being there, it's still a hub of activity, and it adds so much to our streetscape. But this county building is long gone. Does anybody know what this was? This was the hospital at the York County Almshouse. If you know where the prison is on Chestnut Street, that's where this building and its neighbors stood. Can you believe that building was in York and that it was torn down? I mean, what could have told us about being poor in York and about medical treatment in that era? What could have told us about the Civil War? Because there was a large army hospital on Penn Commons, and sometimes they were too full that the soldiers were housed in this hospital building. But then think we have the Hahn House. That's what most of us know it today. It's a funeral home. Originally it was the Emerton family home, and the family that built it was basically bankrupt from building it. So it was the Hahn House for many years, and it was majorly damaged in a fire. And it could have been torn down, but it wasn't. It's such a magnificent example of Tudor architectural style and one of J.A. Temple's greatest residences. Very important to the Springdale community. But these mansions have fallen. These were York's business and political leaders. The top left was Springdale, was the home of Charles Barnett, who was a local politician, and a lot of the national leaders would visit him there. Bottom left is Theodore Helm's house. He owned the brewery, he owned a hotel. That building stood at the intersection of West Market Street and Richland Avenue. You know what's there today? Exxon. Across the street was the home on the top right, Daniel Lafian. He was a retailer who was elected to Congress. Where his home once stood, we have a parking lot today. And on the bottom right was Edgecombe, the home of Arthur Briggs Farquhar. This was located across the street from the athletic fields at York College. These homes have all been demolished, but what stories could they have told us about the leaders of York, about business in York, about life in York if you were well-to-do, as all these gentlemen were? But then all you need to do is drive by the old Variety Iron Works or the Smizer Royer Foundry. It's located half a block away from the Kodo and right there by the stadium. This was a building that was in disrepair and underutilization for a long, long time, and now it's the York Academy. They've brought back an industrial building, a very attractive industrial building, and it has life, and it's brought vibrancy to the surrounding community. There used to be a lot of theaters in York. The Mystic, the Wizard, the Auditorium, the York Opera House. They're all gone. But what stories would they have to tell? They could tell us about performing arts, about vaudeville, about the arrival of moving pictures in York and when moving pictures became talkies. They could tell us about the Ferry of the Cadorus, which is the name of an opera that was put on at the York Opera House. But we have the Strand and Capitol Theaters. I mean, these are dazzling jewels, not only in our performing arts community, but in our downtown. We are so fortunate that we still have these theaters. So many buildings have fallen. Churches, chapels, schools. And the things about churches and schools is they may be buildings, but they were buildings that had their own communities. People didn't just go to church, they were baptized there. They were confirmed there. They were married there. Their funerals were there. All those stories. And think of schools. How many people go to a school or went to a school that has been torn down? A handful. A lot, though. There's a lot of memories that have disappeared over the years. I worry about these buildings. These are all buildings that are in danger of demolition, or they are just severely underutilized, and you wonder what their future holds. On the top left there is the Griffith Smith building, early 1800s federal structure, one of the oldest buildings in the city, and it's really hard to see, but above the first floor to the window on the left, there's a little red and yellow square. Do you know what that means? It's a sign for firefighters, and it says, "Let this building burn." Can we let that happen? These places matter, don't they? So here's what we need to do. We need to move beyond the negative of what's been torn down and the way the town used to be. We need to say mattered disappears from our vocabulary, because these places matter. And there are some things we need to know about historic renovation, and that should drive us as we move forward. First of all, historic renovation creates a sense of place. There are so many austere downtowns. The demolition throughout the United States has basically created cities that are interchangeable with one another because they all have the same shiny new buildings. We don't have that around here. We have an amazing diversity of architectural styles. And for a meeting like we're having tonight, what a better sense of place than a market celebrating 125 years in business. Because of that, the Central Market House matters. Historic renovation sustains the environment. I've done some presentations on this over the years, and it seems like it's falling on deaf ears for a lot of people that own historic buildings. There's been so many demolition projects for important structures, but what happens is that when a building is built, there is so much energy that goes into building the structure. That energy is then called embodied, right? The labor to build it, to transport the materials, to make the materials, the windows, the bricks, the shingles, the siding, whatever the case may be, that energy is not wasted, it's embodied in the building. And so when you tear the building down, you're getting rid of all that energy, and you're using all new energy to do the demolition. Remember that statistic, 25 to 40% of waste in landfills today comes from demolished buildings. The York County Commissioners decided to take their old courthouse and renovate it into an administrative center. It was York County's first green building certified historic renovation, and it was York County's first green building certified office building, old or new. This project was great for the environment and great for the community. Historic renovation impacts the economy because when you build a new building, a lot of the cost goes into the materials. When you renovate a building, particularly a historic building, a lot of the expense goes toward the labor. Labor creates jobs. Labor creates jobs that help the community because the laborers are spending their money locally. Historic renovation has a major impact on local economies. This is the John Schmidt House on South George Street. It was recently renovated, and it matters to Springdale community and to the York community. Historic renovation revitalizes communities. Now, I don't think anybody looks at the old Maple Press or Bicomp building and thinks this is an architectural marvel. But the reality is that when you're able to renovate a structure and use it for a new purpose, you're often revitalizing the community around it. This building is in a community that needs jolt. And Think Loud Development and the Rock Group Live is renovating this. It's a building that's going to matter greatly to the surrounding neighborhood. Historic renovation connects us with the past. It builds a bridge to what used to be. It helps us learn about great people and everyday lives. It helps us learn the lessons of the past and ensure that we don't repeat mistakes that have been made. This is the William Goodrich House on East Philadelphia Street. It is the home of a former slave and is a verified stop on the Underground Railroad. There are only a couple of these in the United States. Crispus Attucks has for many years been trying to renovate this into an Underground Railroad museum, but the grants have dried up and they still need a lot of financial support to make it a reality. This place matters a whole lot, not just to our community, but to the national story of the Civil War and the Underground Railroad. And finally, historic renovation drives tourism. Think Williamsburg, think Biltmore, think Fort McHenry. People crave authenticity and they crave heritage, and in historic buildings, they get both. So think Gates House and Plow Tavern. For a lot of us growing up in New York, there was a rite of passage to take a school field trip to the Gates and Plow. Now sadly, less and less schools are doing that. A lot of kids today didn't go visit them when they were growing up. But yet these are still extremely important structures to York. They drive tourism into the community because people want to tour old buildings. So the Gates House and Plow Tavern matter. So I want to leave you with two parting thoughts today. And one was to revisit a point I made earlier in the presentation. Historic preservation is community preservation. You need to look at it that way, and you need to preach that gospel to other people. It's not about saving buildings just because they're pretty. It's not about dictating the way buildings must look. It's about saving the surrounding communities. And the second thing is that York, Pennsylvania, well, there's a town that really matters. So thank you very much.